Bernadino. She got her undergraduate degree at New York University, magna cum laude, and then went on to University of New Mexico to get her PhD with distinction only about 8 years ago, and since then has published a book that has gotten lots of rave reviews. She has 2 books under contract. She has 10 articles and chapters, and she's editing 30 manuscripts.
It's for the Cambridge Element series, so a bunch of like little books on Nietzsche.
Books.
Yeah. Small books.
She does an incredible amount of work in academia and has been very successful so far. And we're very lucky to have her visiting us today. Thank you for joining us. Please welcome Dr. Kaitlyn Creasy.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Professor Jennings. And thank you so much for having me, too. It's really, really nice to be out and to have a chance to talk about this stuff with a new group of people. So thanks for showing up. I'm going to start off just by letting you know very broadly what my aims for the talk are. And then we'll take a deep dive into the different aims through the different sections of the talk. So my first aim is to highlight certain choice-worthy forms of emotional engagement and experience, the lack of which may cause loneliness. And these are the having people in your life who care about what you care about for its own sake, and certain forms of emotional resonance with other people. And then the second aim, right? So first I'll talk about these particularly meaningful forms of emotional experience and engagement. And then the second aim is to show the significance of these forms of emotional engagement and experience for forms of recognition, affirmation, and connection that I'm going to characterize as especially deep, which are also, I'll contend, forms of recognition, affirmation, and connection that we find incredibly meaningful and fulfilling. So quickly, why deep? And by the way, you can sort of follow along. This first part is the aim section. Well, because I think that these forms of emotional engagement and experience allow others to more fully apprehend and appreciate especially significant and psychically deep features of us, including features that fundamentally shape our perspectives, how we see and experience the world, and our motivational lives. And of course, this goes both ways. So if I'm able to provide deep affirmation to someone else, I'm also able to apprehend and appreciate these features of them too. A quick note before I go on, I'm going to keep talking about recognition, affirmation, connection. I'm going to treat these largely as distinct phenomena, but they overlap. So just keep that in mind. For example, certain forms of deep affirmation will involve a kind of recognition, and that enables a kind of connection. Still, we can hold them apart, and that's part of what I'll be doing in the talk. Okay, so to get started, I want to give you an initial view to work with on loneliness that I'll then sort of engage with and trouble a little bit as we move through the talk. So in his book, Life is Hard, philosopher Kiran Setia says that loneliness results when we don't have other people in our life who recognize our unconditional worth as a human being and reflect that back to us. And on this view of loneliness, like with this diagnosis of loneliness as a particular kind of problem, there is an easy solution, not easily done, but there's a particular kind of solution here. And that's to make and have affirmative friends who love you for your own sake and can reflect that, can reflect your value and worth back to you, your unconditional worth and value as a human being back to you. I say I'm going to start with this because we're going to trouble it pretty quickly. I think this certainly captures certain experiences of loneliness. This captures a dimension of loneliness, but there are other forms of loneliness and other dimensions of loneliness that it doesn't quite cover. And we can see this by attending to an example, which is on the handout. For all these examples, I'm just going to read them verbatim so you can follow along, and then we'll analyze them a bit. This is the example of Beatrice. So if you were here last night, same example. Beatrice has a small group of loving, supportive friends, all of whom she's known since childhood. While studying abroad in Italy in her second year of college, she experiences an aesthetic, evaluative, and practical transformation, developing keen interest in philosophy and 13th century Italian poetry, and deciding to pursue a career in philosophy. Upon her return, she also finds that she has an increased need to engage intellectually. While her friends are fascinated by the changes she's undergone, they neither understand nor share her new interests. They are also unable to engage with her intellectually in the way that she desires. Sitting amidst her closest friends in her childhood home, as she has done hundreds of times before, Beatrice finds herself feeling newly lonely. As I also explained last night, this is really a lightly fictionalized version of my own situation in college, right? We weren't sitting in my childhood home, we were sitting in a car outside of my friend's house. But I remember just having this experience. What this example helps us see is that Setya's view isn't going to capture all forms of loneliness. So before I say why, let me get a definition of loneliness, a working definition down. So I'm going to here be treating loneliness as a painful subjective feeling that results when our desires for recognition or connection are not fulfilled or are perceived to be unfulfilled. But notice that we have very many desires for connection, right? We have very many different desires for forms of recognition. There are very many desirable forms of recognition. Not just this very basic reflecting back of your unconditional worth to you from the friend. And in particular, it seems to me that there are certain needs that we have, needs for recognition, affirmation, and connection, that have to do with how people engage with our particularities, with particular features of our individual selves. And these are needs that, if they're not fulfilled or if they're left unsatisfied, will leave us feeling lonely. So let me break this down just a little bit, and we'll talk about each of these. So we want to be recognized in our particularity, to be seen and understood as the particular individuals that we are, with our particular qualities and idiosyncrasies. We also want to be affirmed in our particularity, to be appreciated and affirmed as a particular individuals that we are, where this involves a kind of sensitivity and responsiveness to valued features of us. And we want to connect with others, but the forms of connection that we want, that we desire, will often be fixed by certain features of our particular self, by certain of our, again, qualities or idiosyncrasies. Right? So we are different people who desire to connect with people in different ways about different things, and so on. And so I use this example of Beatrice in response to Setya's gloss on loneliness to show that his view won't do. We need to say more about particularity and particular recognition, connection, and so on. And I argue that plausibly, Beatrice's loneliness in this situation can be explained by the fact that she lacks affirmative particular recognition. That is, she doesn't feel seen or affirmed as the particular person she is, as well as certain forms of connection and engagement with others, the sort of issue from her particularity. So this is a view that I formulated in my earlier work. I'm going to now bring in another view of what's happening in Beatrice's situation that will help complicate the picture a bit, and will also serve as a kind of foil, someone I can respond to as I develop further what exactly is involved with these particular forms of recognition and affirmation. So in a 2024 article, Ramon Alvarado says that Beatrice's loneliness isn't really about recognition. Instead, it's an epistemic form of loneliness that shows up when we lack epistemic connections or the mutual and reciprocal sharing and articulation of knowledge with epistemic partners. So Alvarado will say, what Beatrice is really missing in this situation, fundamentally, are intellectual goods, epistemic goods, intellectual goods. And to that I say, well, sure. She's missing those, but it's not clear that that's what she's fundamentally missing. It's not clear that that's what she's most basically missing. And it seems like this view is overly narrow and that it potentially obscures more important interpersonal goods that someone in Beatrice's situation will be missing. I can say even more here, or try to say even more here. I highly doubt that Beatrice would experience loneliness in this kind of situation if she didn't care about those intellectual goods, if she didn't care about those epistemic connections. Like there are a lot of intellectual goods that I'm missing out, for example, on when I'm not talking with chemists about chemistry and learning more about chemistry. But I don't feel a feeling of loneliness because of that lack, right? So there's something more basic going on here, and that's what I want to point us toward. And as a way of pointing us toward this, I want to read through a scenario that Alvarado gives in his article responding to my work that he uses as the basis for rejecting recognition as an explanation. So I'm just going to read this out. It's a pretty long excerpt. You can just read along. I think it's a really nice way of honing in on what's still missing. So Creasy thinks that it is a kind of recognition that's missing in cases like Beatrice's. That this is the case is not immediately obvious. Consider that the student who returns home after a long stay abroad brings with them a novel set of skills and richness of knowledge about certain things in the world. Imagine that their friends are in admiration of them for having such knowledge and skills. Imagine they think of them as special and even explicitly recognize them as the one special person in town capable of X. And they do so by sharing their collective admiration. Imagine this explicit recognition expands to the community, such that the town council and the local media fundraise to give this person an endowed chair, to impart X to others, and finance a publication based on this person's knowledge of X. Can this person be or feel justifiably lonely in an intellectual or epistemic sense? I think so. If so, then it is not an issue of recognition. Okay. So here's what I want to say. There are a couple things. There are many things I want to say in response to this sort of framing, but I'll say a couple of things. The first thing is not going to be as crucial, but it's something I want to flag as I'm moving through the material on recognition so that we understand what's meant there. So first of all, it's important to point out recognition of the sort that I'm interested in when I talk about particular recognition is not just admiration, right? It involves feeling seen as the person you understand yourself to be, like feeling really seen. Right? If you feel like that, then you feel like you're recognized. It's not recognition as like you get a bunch of accolades and now you're recognized. It's a different kind of thing. So in a way, Alvarado already misses the mark there slightly, but that's not the thing that I'm going to pay as much attention to. What I want to point out here is, I think by the time we get to the end of this, that we will all find that it makes good sense for Beatrice or someone in her situation to still feel lonely. But I don't think that this is explicable solely in terms of epistemic or intellectual goods. I think that there's something more fundamental going on here, although in Beatrice's particular case, it involves a kind of lack of epistemic or intellectual goods. So think of it this way. You may have very many people in your life who find you impressive without having anyone in your everyday life who has a sense of what's so impressive about you, or who cares about what you do for its own sake, and not just for the sake of its seeming impressiveness, or because it's something that you care about and they care about you. So I think what's missing in Beatrice's life still is a sense of why what she's done or accomplished or something, like if we want to talk in terms of accomplishments, like there's a sense of why that's good to accomplish, why that's worth accomplishing in the first place. So notice here that in order to have someone who has a sense of what's so impressive, there is going to be like a basic level of familiarity that the person will need with the thing that you've done or the field that you're in or the value that you have. So for others to value a particular identity, activity, or project requires a sufficient degree of familiarity. But even if you have friends who are intimately familiar with your valued project or activity, yet fail to value it in the right way, I think you'll still feel lonely. So here's an example. Imagine, some of you haven't yet been to graduate school, but I'm going to talk about graduate school for a sec. So we can talk about it in terms of undergrad too. But imagine that you make a friend in college, or maybe a fellow philosophy major in college, or maybe you make a friend in graduate school, and the two of you move through the field together. You eventually graduate, you both land jobs in philosophy, and this person has a very good understanding of what academic philosophy involves. They're very familiar with the conventions of the field, and so on and so on and so on. But imagine this friend one day becomes disillusioned and comes to believe that philosophical inquiry isn't actually worthwhile. Maybe they have a life crisis. This person is very familiar with the thing that you do and that you value, but they no longer value it. And that's a loss. It's an interpersonal loss. We've lost someone who values what we value for its own sake. And it's reasonable, it's understandable if we feel lonely after that loss, especially when and if that is the person, if that was the only person we can imagine, thought experiment style, we had in our lives to reflect that value back to us, to value that thing with us. So I think in Beatrice's situation, what's going on arguably most fundamentally, or like one piece of this fundamental picture of what Beatrice is missing, like Beatrice is missing co-valuers. And without co-valuers, she's unable to secure important forms of recognition and affirmation, and this is why she feels lonely. Note that the more central a valued project or activity or good is to your identity or life, the more likely you'll be to suffer loneliness in the absence of co-valuers. So think of it this way. I really, really love tasty food. Let me think of a thing. I love goat cheese, okay? I really love goat cheese. I've like cried over goat cheese before. I love it. There's a sense in which I value goat cheese. If you're not a vegan, just eat some goat cheese. Go ahead, try it out. It's so tasty. I'm not like suffering when there aren't people around me who don't value goat cheese. Like it's nice when someone's like, oh yeah, I love the taste of hay in my cheese. Like cool, you get it, great. Like that's reassuring, it's validating. But my love of goat cheese isn't central to my life. My love of philosophy is, very central to my life. And it's not just the love of philosophy of the field, it's like philosophy of the practice, philosophy of the thing we can do together, and so on and so forth. And so in the absence of people who value that thing around which I'm orienting my life, that's like a key part of my identity, I'll feel lonely when I lack a co-valuer, right? Okay, good. So let me say a bit more about the importance of co-valuers and the kinds of interpersonal goods that having co-valuers allow for us to realize. I'm going to give another example here, one that's less weighted in the direction of the sort of like epistemic intellectual stuff, right? Beatrice is all about philosophy and intellectual engagement and blah, blah, blah. We're going to go a different route now with the case of Nina, the talented jazz pianist. So again, I'm going to just read this through and you can follow along. So Nina is a talented jazz pianist whose identities as a musician and appreciator of music are central to her self-conception. She's a talented and innovative improviser whose deep familiarity with the piano and the conventions of the genre allow her to create moving and innovative jazz melodies spontaneously. An appreciator of music with a persistent love of instrumental jazz, she values music as an especially meaningful form of expression. Its distinctive ability to rouse and direct human feeling through a single sense has always inspired awe in her. Among other things, she values music's potential to crystallize, articulate, and express feelings without the use of concepts. Its ability to serve as a non-conceptual resource for making us intelligible to one another. Her friends are loving and supportive appreciate many of her qualities and find her impressive. But none of them relate to music as she does. No one in her life shares her passion for jazz. Although they are casual music listeners who enjoy other genres, they don't enjoy jazz and don't listen to it. In addition, none have developed ideas about the function or significance of music. This leaves Nina feeling lonely. So in this situation, what's happening is that there's no one in Nina's life who cares about what she cares about as she cares about it, in the way that she cares about it. There's no one that values what she values for its own sake. And in this particular situation, as I've sort of constructed it, in fact, there's no one in her life that she has who's presently able to value jazz for its own sake because they're just not sufficiently familiar with it. Okay, I'm going to say a little bit about how sharing values facilitates connection, affirmation, and recognition. But just a quick pause for a moment. As I'm reading through this, it's a long chunk of text, right? It's a long example. It's detailed. That's not just that's not just writerly indulgence. When it comes to these forms of connection and recognition and affirmation, like the details matter. The details of your particularity matter, the details of how you relate to the thing matter, right? The reasons you give for why this is a thing that's worth pursuing matters, right? So that's intentional. It's long, it takes a while to read through during a talk, but it should be this way, right? The more details we have, the better we're able to understand these forms of connection, recognition, and affirmation. Okay, so first claim, I take it to be fairly uncontroversial, but I think that highlighting it is important. I think it's something we don't always pay enough attention to. First claim, sharing values, that is, like here are some examples, valued projects, identities, and activities, is an important form of interpersonal connection. And without that form of interpersonal connection, we may feel lonely. I think that's fairly uncontroversial. And of course, this requires co-valuers, sharing values in this more robust sense. In addition to important forms of connection, sharing values will facilitate an important form of particular recognition. So being seen as the particular valuer that you are. So we, human beings, are valuers, but of course, we're individual valuers who value particular things. And recognition of your evaluative identity, which I'm thinking here as a species of particular recognition, requires that others in your life have some familiarity with your valued projects, identities, and so on. And without such others, these parts of your evaluative identity, which are part of you, right, remain unseen. And that might leave you feeling unseen and lonely. Since robustly valuing a particular project in the way that a co-valuer would do requires sufficient familiarity with the valued project, then engaging with co-valuers facilitates recognition of this dimension of you. So we get this kind of recognition by engaging with co-valuers in this more indirect way. And notice the kind of recognition I'm talking about here, again, isn't about recognition of my status as like a real academic philosopher, and it isn't about recognition as like admiration. You're a really good philosopher. It's not value-laden yet. It's just like, oh, you value philosophy, where this means something that I understand, right? Where I'm like familiar with what it means to value philosophy, the thing. That's something we can get through engaging with co-valuers. Importantly, since the recognition involved here isn't yet value-laden, you can attain it without co-valuers. So you don't need co-valuers for this. For example, your disillusioned philosopher friend can grant you this kind of particular recognition. Still, co-valuers facilitate it, since in order to value in the way that's required here, you need to have sufficient familiarity. All right. Then most interestingly, and probably most centrally for the talk today. It is only between co-valuers that a form of deep affirmation becomes possible, involving an appreciation of the value of certain dimensions of your particular evaluative identity. So think about what values are for us, right? Our values, at least some of our values, maybe not our value of goat cheese, some of our values are centrally important parts of us. They make up part of who we are. So without anyone to appreciate the worth of these values, including the worthwhileness of our valued projects and identities, there's going to be an important part of us that goes unaffirmed, right? Unappreciated. In other words, to secure deep affirmation as a person with a particular evaluative identity, we need someone who understands the value of that evaluative identity, who understands the value of the things that we value. But this requires someone who values my values for their own sake, not merely instrumentally as like a means to some end, and not simply in virtue of their status as values of mine. Right, so this form of deep affirmation is going to be impossible without co-valuers. Like, for example, if I have I'll use the philosophy example over and over because it's the easiest one to use. If I have a partner who really loves me and knows how important philosophy is to me, and they love me for my own sake, and they love the things I care about, or they care about things I care about because I care about them and they love me, right? Like, that's a very nice relationship to be in. It's wonderful. Will it give me this kind of deep affirmation? No. Because it's missing, unless, right? Not necessarily. Because it's possible that they don't value the thing for its own sake. And that's what we need to have a co-valuer. So I can have someone wonderful and loving who in some way values my values because they're parts of me, without valuing them in the right kind of way. And then I'll be missing out on this form of deep affirmation, right? So a partner like this, for example, might not be able to understand the goodness, first of all, the worthwhileness of philosophical pursuits, but like the goodness of a particular bit of philosophical progress that I've made. They can't affirm it, appreciate it in this more robust way, but my co-valuers, my fellow philosophers with shared interests might be able to do that, right? Notice here, the point is not that your partner or anyone in your life should be doing all of these things. It's that people do different things. And that people can fulfill different needs for us, right? It's possible, of course, that someone does all these things. That's fine. But they need not. Okay. In sum, then, without co-valuers, there's no one to appreciate the worthiness of your values or evaluative identity. And lacking this deep form of affirmation, you may feel lonely. And again, that's interesting because even in this sort of wonderful situation where you have someone who loves you for your own sake and who even appreciates your values because they're parts of you, that's how much they love you, you can still feel lonely, right, if you're missing this form of deep affirmation. So let me say a bit now on the importance of emotional engagement for sharing values. And I'm going to bring in another example here to make this point. So when it comes to finding genuine co-valuers, and so securing these important forms of connection and affirmation that can ameliorate certain forms of loneliness, the manner in which others engage with your valued projects, identities, and activities will matter. So look at the example of Nina and Vladimir. Vladimir is based, by the way, on Vladimir Nabokov, who had musical anhedonia, which is interesting. Just FYI, a little tidbit. Now you know that, and also that I love goat cheese. Okay. So one night, Nina meets Vladimir. What's anhedonia? Musical anhedonia. So an inability to derive pleasure from music. Mm-hmm. But we'll get there. So one night, Nina meets Vladimir. Vladimir is a musical savant and jazz nerd, and the two become friends. Like Nina, he's well versed in the conventions of jazz and has a deep familiarity with jazz history and music theory. In addition to improvising together, they have gratifying conversations about many topics of interest and significance to Nina, topics that she was, until now, unable to talk to another person about. For example, points of influence among jazz musicians, and what makes for an especially innovative improvisational move. During one of these conversations, Vladimir reveals that he is a very atypical jazz nerd. He suffers from a form of musical anhedonia that leaves him affectively indifferent to music, including jazz music. Although he enjoys learning jazz facts and believes that jazz is a valuable part of culture, he doesn't personally enjoy listening to it, including the pieces he plays. Nor does he enjoy playing jazz music, though he plays the clubs as often as he can, since he enjoys the admiration he receives, the friendships he's made with other jazz musicians, and the remuneration. Classic philosopher's example, I know. But it does some work, because notice here that in Vladimir, Nina has a friend who can engage in and is familiar with an activity and good of central importance to her, jazz music, is better positioned than anyone else in her life to recognize her in her particularity, and who judges an activity that she values valuable. But still, what Nina doesn't have in this case is a co-valuer, someone with whom she can experience more robust forms of connection or deep affirmation. So recall that these forms of connection and affirmation require others who robustly value what you value for its own sake. But genuinely valuing some identity, project, or good requires certain emotional susceptibilities on the behalf of the valuer and tended emotional responses with respect to the identity, the project, whatever. And the absence of these emotional susceptibilities and dispositions to respond suffice to disqualify the individual as a valuer. So without this emotional component, you can judge valuable, you can believe valuable, but you can't be a genuine valuer. You can't be someone who robustly values a thing. So, while Vladimir judges jazz valuable, he cannot be said to value jazz. And since jazz thus doesn't matter to him as it matters to Nina, it'll make sense if she remains lonely, even in this much better situation that she's got going on now. And it will also make sense if she eventually makes friends with a co-valuer and it alleviates that form of loneliness. So notice then that the various interpersonal goods I've been exploring, so this particular recognition, the connection that comes from sharing values, and this deep affirmation, are all going to require certain forms of emotional engagement with others. And the amelioration of loneliness that they can perform, or that will happen as you secure these goods, also requires a certain level of emotional engagement from others with respect to your valued object, right? Where this is like very general object language, project, activity, good, whatever it is. Of course, there are shallower forms of affirmation that can result from someone who judges your identity, goods, or projects valuable. But deep affirmation of the sort I'm talking about here requires that another values them, that they appreciate the intrinsic worthwhileness of the identity, project, or good in question, however inarticulate they may be about why that thing is worth pursuing. Okay, so we have co-valuers as long as we have others in our lives who value what we value for its own sake. But there are still different possibilities for affirmation and connection, even among co-valuers, that depend on the reasons that they would give for valuing the thing. So while just having co-valuers with which you're engaging regularly will foster certain forms of connection, recognition, and affirmation, the more justifying reasons that two co-valuers share for valuing a particular activity or project, the more opportunities for connection and deep affirmation there will be. So remember I have that line, I gave this spiel about details and how important these details are in this long-ass example. Remember I had that line there where I said, okay, she cares about jazz and she likes it because in part it facilitates the making intelligible of herself to others in this non-conceptual way, like performs this unique function. She gives this reason for why she would value jazz. Now it's possible that she has co-valuers who value jazz, genuinely value jazz and value jazz for its own sake. But if you were to ask them, like, hey, why do you value jazz? What's so good about jazz? Give me a list. They wouldn't put on their list the way that can serve as a non-conceptual resource for making me intelligible to others. Fair, that's fine. And yet, if there's someone who understands what that means and like also has that as a reason that they would put on their list for why they value jazz, that makes an even deeper form of connection possible and affirmation possible. That's the claim here. All right. So let me say even more about this. Let me talk, though, about the role of personal relationships here. So as I think should be clear already, co-valuing can facilitate these interpersonal goods, connection, recognition, affirmation, independently of a personal relationship, where someone's come to know me personally and I've come to know them personally. But loving personal relationships, including friendships, with co-valuers will be especially valuable. So we can imagine that if Nina makes very close friends with a co-valuer of jazz, Al, who also loves her for her own sake, like that's going to be a very special relationship with a very special potential for interpersonal relatedness that's able to realize a number of these goods. So when we have people with whom we're interacting regularly who not only love us, but who also value what we value for its own sake, then this is going to facilitate what I'll call deeply affirmative particular recognition. So here we have a loving personal relationship. We also have a co-valuer. It's a loving personal relationship with a co-valuer that makes deeply affirmative particular recognition possible. So this requires that another value or care about you for your own sake, but also that they value or care about a practical identity of yours, a good that you're pursuing or to which you're aspiring, or a valued life product of yours for its own sake. And so they'd value it even if they weren't in that relationship with you. This, again, I think is an especially meaningful possibility for us, where we're able to be loved for the particular person that we are and for our own sake, for what we take to be the right kind of reasons, where that involves the other person apprehending the value of the things that we value centrally. And it makes sense, like it's intelligible, it's reasonable, I think, to be lonely even in a case where you lack all of these things together, right? So if you lack an instance of deeply affirmative particular recognition, a relationship that makes this kind of thing possible, you might still feel lonely. And you might feel lonely because it's the whole complex of things hanging together that sometimes matters quite a lot, right? So if you lack someone who both cares about you, right? Katie, the philosopher, and also values philosophy too, I may feel lonely, even if I have someone who loves Katie, the particular person for my own sake, and I have someone who loves philosophy. Do we see this? Yeah, okay, good. Another way to put this is that we may feel that we can't be loved for the right reasons as the particular people that we are without another person's valuing or caring about what we care about for its own sake, right? So we want to be loved, sure, but sometimes we want to be loved for certain reasons. This comes out in the philosophy of love literature a bunch. So like if someone were to ask my partner, like, why do you love Katie? He's like, well, she's a human being. Like that'd be like, I wouldn't be happy with that. But if he was like, but she's Katie, I'd be like, oh, that's nice. That's better. If he's like, Katie the human being, that's nice, right? But there are certain reasons we might want to be loved for. Absent being loved for those particular reasons, we might feel some loneliness still. Okay. So to sort of wrap this portion of the talk up, notice that these deeper forms of connection, recognition, affirmation that I've been talking about require certain forms of emotional engagement with you and your valued projects. And these forms of emotional engagement are forms of care, forms of concern, forms of interest. Possibly other things too, but these are some general things that we can say. Right, a co-valuer cares about what I care about, they're interested in what I'm interested in, they're concerned about what I'm concerned about. If it's threatened, they're upset, just like I would be, and so on. All right, on to sympathetic emotional resonance and what it makes possible. So in addition to these attitudes of care, concern, and interest associated with co-valuing, there are other emotional experiences, the sharing of which can facilitate belonging and ameliorate loneliness. I'm going to focus here on experiences of what I call sympathetic emotional resonance. And I'll define those as experiences involving the coordination of two individuals' first personal feelings or emotional responses in response to some object in the world. And I'm thinking of this here as the sort of affective or emotional analog of sympathetic acoustic resonance. For example, what occurs when the E string on a guitar without itself being struck will vibrate in sympathy with the A string due to these strings sharing of a frequency on certain tunings. I'm going to give you another example so we can start to get a grip on what this sort of thing might look like. The example of Joel and Kate vibing. So Kate and Joel are two philosophers who have a good professional relationship, a handful of shared philosophical interests, and a recently developed friendship. One day, driving back from a conference, they discover their mutual love of the song Real Love Baby by Father John Misty. Kate puts it on the radio, and although neither of them knows all the words, both sing along loudly and joyfully, feeling themselves uplifted by the bright, hopeful music and the poignant features of human existence captured by the song. So in this example, Joel and Kate's emotional lives are in sync. Or I'll say, like, they're vibing together on the song. To vibe with another person in this way involves having sufficiently similar first personal affective responses to some feature of the world, which is typically one jointly experienced. So when they're vibing, like when the song is playing and they're driving along and they're singing loudly, they're sharing in an experience that they weren't having before, right? So they're having a shared experience of a sort that they weren't having when they were just sitting next to each other, for example, driving on the 10. They're together when they're vibing in a new way. And this is reflected in the atmosphere of togetherness that emerges as they're listening to the song together. I see some people like nodding their heads, and that's good. Because there's this like atmosphere of togetherness stuff where all you can do is do this. But that's what it is. We know what we mean here. There are very many like montages in movies, right, road trip movies especially, where there's like two friends like driving along, right? And we feel that. We know what that's like. Or we can if we haven't had it, we like imagine what it's like. Or maybe we've had it on other things with respect to other things. These are experiences of like vibing involved in sympathetic emotional resonance. So notice in this kind of example, there are a number of resonant relationships. So there's a resonance between Joel and the song, so Joel's vibing on the song, Kate in the song, Kate's vibing on the song. But there's also a resonance between Joel and Kate. Like they're vibing on the song together, right? And it's that last thing, that interpersonal phenomenon that I'm trying to point out here, that is sympathetic emotional resonance, right? So the moment that they're vibing together on the song. This is but one example. There are many examples of this kind of thing, and once you start to recognize it as a type of thing in the first place, you can see it. So other instances of sympathetic emotional resonance might involve two sisters grieving the death of their mother together, like sitting down in a room and really grieving the death of their beloved parent together. We can imagine a pub full of elated others who are celebrating after a World Cup win, right? There too, they're having this experience of sympathetic emotional resonance made possible by the joy that they're all experiencing together. Right? Shaler has this interesting analysis of truly loving sexual intercourse being an instance of sympathetic emotional resonance that involves so much togetherness that you start to identify with the other, and he calls this a kind of mutual coalescence. And another kind of sympathetic emotional resonance that we might have involves the coordination of reactive or second personal attitudes with other people. So when, for example, I'm proud of you for, or when I admire you for something you've accomplished, and you in that same moment feel pride, right? We're responding in the same kind of way to this thing. And the actual feelings are different here, but they're coordinated, they're consonant. It's still going to count as an instance of sympathetic emotional resonance. Or we can imagine that I might have a friend who treats me poorly, does something wrong, there's some act of wrongdoing that happens, and I resent them for their act of wrongdoing. And imagine I bring it up to them resentfully. And as I'm sharing this resentfully, they feel this deep guilt, and I can tell they feel this deep guilt. That's, again, a kind of coordination of our first personal emotional or affective responses to the world. And so that, too, will count as an instance of sympathetic emotional resonance that brings us together. And, of course, the other side of it is like the absence of that will push us apart, can leave us feeling not only lonely, but deeply misunderstood. More about that in a sec. So notice here that sharing certain values and cares, right, whether those are valued projects that I have or certain normative frameworks in the example of these like reactive attitudes toward other people, will increase the likelihood of experiences of sympathetic emotional resonance between people. So think back to two philosophers who are really excited about a puzzle. Like we're both gripped, we're both really interested. Well, yeah, we're going to be more likely to have these shared experiences of grip and interest and deep care and maybe excitement about a puzzle and so on if we really care about the thing, right? So sharing values will make more of these kinds of experiences likely for us. So why are these experiences so important? What do they do for us? I'd argue that they're important because they're experiences of shared emotional intelligibility. And experiences of shared emotional intelligibility, I'll say more about what that is in just a sec, foster feelings of belonging, of feeling at home in the world. So when we have experiences of shared emotional intelligibility, we have this consonance, we experience this consonance among emotional orientations that can make us feel just a bit more like we fit in the world, since there's someone else for whom the world makes similar sense. Right? There's someone else who really likes this very boppy Father John Misty song. Right? The world makes similar sense to them. There's someone else who's really getting the grievability of my parents' death. There's someone else who really understands how important it is that whichever soccer team, I don't know, I'm so bad at all the sports, wins, right? So that it provides this experience of really feeling at home because the world makes sense similarly to someone else. And this is happening at this like deep affective level, and we can sort of feel it. It's deeply comforting, I would say. All right. So to have a resonant emotional experience with another person, when the object of that experience is some jointly experienced feature of the world, is to share with that person a grasp on the world and what matters, even how it matters. And that's because of the special function that emotions play in our lives. And so emotions convey the significance of a situation to us. It's through our emotions that we get a sense of the situation that we find ourselves in, right? So it's through my guilty emotion that I'm like, oh, I'm very attuned through my guilty emotion to the fact that I did something wrong, or at least like that's the impression I'll get, right? There's a significance that comes through the emotion, and arguably there's a kind of significance that can only come through emotions. It's a very deep way of attuning to the significance of things. So these experiences of sympathetic emotional resonance are going to involve pre-reflective, affective forms, that is emotional forms, of shared understanding, in which you share an affective or emotional grasp on the world and its significance with another person. Such experiences convey to the individual that another person shares a point of view or perspective allowing her to feel more deeply seen and understood. And I mean deeply here, right? Because what's happening here is emotional, it's psychically deep for us. In addition to fostering forms of connection, experiences of resonance like this, of emotional resonance, are going to be extremely meaningful for beings like us. Affective as well as social beings who have a deep need for emotional orientation. To completely lack shared emotional intelligibility, first, I don't know that we could even function. I don't even know what that would look like. But we can imagine like very, very dire circumstances. We can kind of imagine what it would look like, I think. But to completely lack shared emotional intelligibility would result in profound loneliness. But we can experience loneliness even when shared emotional intelligibility is missing in contexts that are more local. When we have relationships or experiences in which resonance is not achieved. Right? So we don't have to totally lack intelligibility to feel lonely. It's enough that there's some disconnect emotionally between me and the person I'm experiencing something next to. And that'll be exacerbated when the thing that I'm experiencing feels especially significant to me. A few examples that can highlight this. So if I'm grieving the death of my parent, who I love deeply and realize was flawed, but really good or something like that. We can flesh this out a little bit. And my siblings are all estranged from the parent. They don't love the parent any longer, and they don't think the parent's especially good. And I'm grieving alone. And they're just kind of like, yeah, good riddance, haha, they deserved it. I'd be pretty lonely. Loneliness makes very good sense in this kind of situation. And think too of a case where you resent someone for doing something wrong to you, and you share that with them, perhaps resentfully or maybe more coolly, and they just don't feel any guilt. They're like, oh, well, I didn't do anything wrong. And then you go around telling all your friends, and they're like, right? Again, we'll feel lonely. We'll be like, what is the matter with me? Am I crazy? Right? So this is like the basic orienting function, right, that this stuff plays for us. And then another example, which I just think is kind of nice. Imagine that you make a new group of friends that just doesn't get your sense of humor at all. You can't make laugh. And imagine that you had an older group of friends who really got your sense of humor, you could joke around. You'll feel lonely. And you'll feel lonely because you're missing the sort of resonance that came from others responding to the way that you were joking, from you responding emotionally, affectively to the same kind of joke together, right? As you were telling it in this kind of case. Okay. All right. So much for experiences of sympathetic emotional resonance and their significance. Now I want to tie it all together. So far, I've argued that loneliness can result when we lack co-valuers or when we lack experiences of sympathetic emotional resonance. But what I want to point out now is that these two kinds of loneliness, which I think really are two kinds of loneliness, there's some overlap, but they're distinct kinds, are species in a genus of loneliness. So they're kind of this broader form of loneliness. Loneliness experienced in the absence of others for whom things matter in the way that they matter to us. So notice that in addition to feeling and valuing beings, right, beings for whom things matter, for whom certain things have significance, we're social beings. And so we may become deeply disoriented in the absence of others who reflect back what matters to us. And co-valuers and experiences of sympathetic emotional resonance orient us because they make us feel at home in the world. And they do this in different ways. So relationships with co-valuers will allow us to feel like the things we care about are worth caring about, like the projects and identities and values that we have are worthwhile. In the case of sympathetic emotional resonance, where we have these relationships with co-feelers, relationship with co-feelers allow us to feel like the world makes sense, like it makes similar sense, that it matters to someone else as it matters to us. And both of these things are going to make us feel more like we belong, less alone. So these forms of emotional engagement and resonance have a distinct role to play in staving off loneliness. And I think they're plausibly, important constituents of especially meaningful relationships that facilitate belonging. Notice here that while these forms of emotional engagement and experience are going to be most meaningfully experienced in the context of personal relationships, and especially loving personal relationships, they can ameliorate certain forms of loneliness independently of those relationships. And we can wrap our heads around this by thinking about how those relationships get started at all. Right? Often, like being a co-valuer or valuing the same thing, like is the basis for the formation of a personal relationship. Often, like vibing with someone on something, like motivates us to pursue a personal relationship with them. Right? Like this is often how we make friends. Right? Is by first having these kinds of experiences with them, or enjoying certain forms of relation and emotional engagement that come from valuing a thing together. And that's good, right? Because sure, most meaningfully, there'll be this much more robust thing, but you don't need to have a personal relationship to ameliorate the kinds of loneliness that result from a lack of these forms of engagement and experience. Although hopefully, they'll be the basis of one. Okay, that's it. Thanks. Yeah, please.
I guess this is just more of like a clarifying one, but when you talk about people valuing the thing that you value, like intrinsically, versus like for the same reasons as you, is that like kind of the same thing, or do you think it's like separate? And if so, does one matter more than the other? Like whether you share an intrinsic value or you share the same reasons for valuing it?
So if you share reasons, so I think that the valuing it for its own sake matters more for the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So I think like, oh yeah, jazz music, like it'd be worth it, even if it didn't do this non-conceptual connection stuff. Like it's just valuable because it's jazz music. What would we do without it? What would we do without philosophy? Right? It doesn't have to realize some other good. Right? It's like finally valuable is worth doing just for the sake of it. So that's more important because you can share reasons for valuing a thing and still have instrumentally value a thing, right? So well, I love philosophy because it's made me so rich. Just kidding. And my friend loves philosophy because it makes them so rich, but they don't really care about philosophy. I mean, then we might say oh, well, we co-value wealth, and that allows for a particular kind of connection, right? But again, it matters that it's valuing something for its own sake, that's doing the connecting work, and that's also doing the deep affirmation work. Yeah, so that's what I'd say. And I think the reason stuff comes in, because it seems like we can, even if we value jazz music for its own sake or philosophy for its own sake, we can be asked why we value it and then give our reasons. And the more of those we share, I think, the more, right, you're sort of okay, I do this good thing, I would do this thing even if there weren't these other things, but also here's this really amazing thing philosophy does for me. Here's another amazing thing philosophy does for me. The more of those you share, that's oh yeah, we are really, you get it, and so you get me, right? Yeah, good. Really good question. Thanks. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this talk.
Oh, of course.
So I was just wondering if this type of sympathetic emotional resonance we're looking for might in some cases be irrational when we sort of value things that are very niche, like take philosophy, for example, as being as super underappreciated as it is right now and as it should be in contemporary times. It might be the case that I never get the type of co-valuer I might want in philosophy. So I'm wondering if it could be kind of irrational of me to desire this in my future.
Oh yeah, okay. I see. So this is something so here's the thing I do sometimes. I'm going to answer like a couple of versions of the question, and you let me know by the time I get to the end of my response if it's gotten at what you're getting at. Because there are a couple of ways I think your question can be taken. So let me start with the first way, and then let me try to remember the second way that popped up as you were talking. The first thing is like, if we hope for these choice-worthy, like if we want to acquire these very choice-worthy forms of like connection and affirmation, like maybe there are better and worse strategies. Like maybe philosophy is so niche that if I value that and then like go out into the world, I'll never find someone. It's not true, by the way. You will. Look at us. Look at us. Here we are. I'll never find someone who shares that. So like I'd better be like strategic about the thing that I value. Because like what I ultimately value is like feeling connected and together with people, and I need that. It's like that's one way I think of hearing the question that you were asking. And it's just tough because we just don't always choose what we value, do we? I mean, it's as if we could solve it by not valuing philosophy, but it turns out sometimes you like are introduced to a thing and it's good, and you're like, oh, it's good, right? So it might not be convenient. It might not even be like adaptive, right? I don't know, there are plenty of examples in like the philosophical literature, especially meaning life literature, about like these values that no one can make sense of. Like, what if you value making a rubber band ball in your basement? No one could ever value that. And then some people are like, why not? You know, like, you know, but it's kind of like this, right? Well, yeah, it's not going to be intelligible to a lot of people as something that's valuable. And so it's true that it might be harder to achieve these things. But if you realize, so now we're going to hold fixed that you have the value already because you can't control it. But if you recognize that having co-valuers is what allows you to get these things, then you could think, oh, how do I situate myself around co-valuers? What do I do? Where do I go? I'm going to keep going to these philosophy talks, even after I graduate or whatever, right? Does that get at part of what you were asking?
Yeah, sort of. I'm just wondering if, in some sense, we should sort of tailor our desires to a point where we aren't, I guess, just kind of just desiring too much or desiring things that we just won't be able to get in the future, or there's a low likelihood of us getting that particular thing.
Oh, yeah. Okay, maybe I could say some more general things about that kind of thing. I don't think that it's I don't think it's easy to tailor your desires in that way. I don't think it's easy to tailor your values. I think there are ways to do it. You know, this comes out with things like philosophy, but I think it actually comes out really nicely when what we're talking about are like valued relationships or people. Like you can't help like who you want to be around sometimes, or like who you fall in love with or whatever. Like you can't help if you fall in love with philosophy or chemistry or whatever. So I think, I mean, but what you can do is like go no contact with that person because you just don't want to deal with the pain of like whatever, and you want to have a new opportunity for valuing something else and loving something else. So do with philosophy. Maybe you go no contact with philosophy and you're like, I'm not going to read any more philosophy, I'm not going to be reminded of the good of it, and maybe it'll eventually fade away, right? I don't know, that doesn't seem like a good way to live to me. In the case of certain relationships, it will be. Let me just like give this, like if a relationship's harmful and bad and blah, 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 like yeah, sure, do that, right? But like when it comes to things that you really care about, like philosophy, things that that are orienting your life and that are not damaging you actively, where there is this possibility still, like you should try for the possibility. I mean, shoot your shot. You know, you gotta try. There was something else I wanted to say. But there's this more general point about what should we expect? Like, okay, Katie, you know, you've got like affirmation, then you've got deep affirmation, and then you've got deeply affirmative particular recognition, and man, like, there's so much to want. I think like there just is so much to want. I think they're all goods. I think they're worth wanting, and that we all know that they're worth wanting because we're like, well, what if that thing that's really worth wanting isn't something I can have, right? So they're all worth wanting. That seems right. But because they're all interpersonal goods, they also require us to ask things of people, right? or they require others to like give parts of themselves to us or to attend to us in particular ways or engage with us in particular ways. And it's a separate question to ask, like, how much of that should we expect? And I think seriously, I don't think it's like never adjust, never adapt, always just want exactly in the way that you want. I think that's not going to work. I think that's not adaptive, and that the situation will make it apparent when it's not going to happen, and then you really do need to be flexible. With philosophy, it doesn't seem like that sort of thing happens. With relationships, it happens a bit more. With philosophy, it might happen in certain contexts, right? You have to shift how you thought you were going to do philosophy, for example. But yeah, this is a sort of balance that we strike basically as people who are also trying to get through the world and be okay, you know? Sometimes you have to adjust. Sometimes you can stay attached. You can figure out if the attachment is worth it. There will be cases where the attachment is worth it and you have it, you don't have control over it, it's hard to get rid of, and oh well, you know, we're kind of screwed. But sometimes we are just kind of screwed. And then you can just do whatever strategies you can and maybe try other things. We can cultivate values, right? So if it's like a purely strategic approach and what you're strategizing is how to connect and get affirmed, then like pick the most popular value. I don't know what that is. Well, okay. Pick the most popular valued activity or project or whatever. Learn to value that. Often, like, we do learn to value things just by being exposed to them and by engaging with them and so on and so forth. So sure, you could do that. Yeah, why not? But by the time we come into this room, we probably already have some valued projects, some valued activities, some things we really care about, not all of which are fixed, by the way. That changes over the course of your life, right? And when we're here, we're already stuck with them. For now, what do we do? You see? Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, cool.
That was very good life advice, too.
Hey!
Thank you, first of all, for a really beautiful talk,
Oh, thanks.
giving a nice overview of this, and then some really, I think, resonant examples.
Okay.
I'm gonna kind of flip it to the dark side.
Oh, please, yeah.
So predators
Mhm.
and people who actively practice abuse of power take all of these things that you've described.
Oh, yeah.
And kind of, they don't necessarily have to even, study it. They seem to intuitively
Oh, yeah.
know how to jump into all of those things that are the needs for deep affirmation, et cetera, to exploit them.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is,
Yeah.
if we can understand that this is maybe how humans operate within a context of loneliness and seeking affirmations, how do we guard against the exploitation of predators or abuse of power, whether it's, you know, cults, gangs,
Sure.
political types of power, other things?
Yeah, it's really hard, and I think it really is. Okay. So here's my first response or thought: is like it's a bit case by case. It's like, I want to be careful about the kind of things that I like would say at this moment for like advice or this or that. But I think you're onto something important, and that's that like these are interpersonal goods. We really want them. We're really attached to them. They make us feel like we belong, and that need for feeling like we belong is deep. Like that need for emotional orientation, to feel like the world makes sense to someone else, like it makes sense to me, is deep. And we might participate in relationships with people where that need is met, but other needs are not, and they might be extremely damaging in other ways. It depends on the kind of view probably of like well-being you take here, but I think that there are just going to be plenty of very intuitive cases. Like I think as soon as someone is harming you, like they're not in the, like physically, emotionally, like this is gonna take some sussing out, right? Like you have to figure out what is harm, what is like normal relationship strife and so on. But like when someone's harming you, like, okay, don't go there anymore, right? In the predator situation, there'll be situations where someone's like eventually like harming you and it might not be obvious. Like it's hard to attune to it though. That's what the problem.
Be an intent to harm, like with AI. So people that are very lonely, seeking, partners through AI, but then that partner may end up damaging them or harming them because they don't actually deeply recognize their value.
Yeah, like what's required, like there are multiple dimensions of well-being and they're at odds with each other sometimes, and that sucks. That's like the spirit of my response right now, right? Like I do think that I think undeniably certain forms of like interpersonal connection, recognition, and affirmation are like constituents of well-being, and like a flourishing human life will involve those things. But it also involves other things, and it involves the absence of certain things, certain forms of harm, and so on. It involves like, arguably, I'll just say some things it might involve without really committing myself to any of these, like autonomous engagement with your world, like free engagement, right, and so on. So I think a good way to approach a situation like that is to ask yourself, like let me try to list dimensions of well-being here. Like, which ones are being compromised and which ones are being actualized? And like, are there certain dimensions of well-being that are like so important and so fundamental to what it means to be me that like I should never compromise those? I think there are more general things to say. I think that I have plenty of beliefs about like what shouldn't be compromised. Like I think if someone is compromising, if you're in a relationship with someone or with a computer that's like compromising your autonomy, no, don't do that. If they're physically harming you, no, don't do that. No matter all of this. One thing to say about, and I'll say something really quickly about relationships in particular. Maybe like, let's imagine a case of, and I'm sorry, this is like a trigger warning, but like we can imagine like an abusive relationship, for example, that's like physically abusive, where there are co-valuers of like philosophy, for example, or whatever project you might have in mind. I think that, so maybe the person who is the victim in this relationship is securing a certain amount of like affirmation, but that is not a loving way to engage with another person. So they're getting deep affirmation at the same time that they're getting like a negation of their basic worth as a human being and as an autonomous being. That seems like too much to give up, right? So that's the kind of thing I would say about those situations. But it's hard. It is such a good question. Thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead.
Do we have time for another student question? Okay. So thinking about the Vladimir and Nina example that you gave, and then also on page 6, where you said to have a resonant emotional experience with a person is to share with that person a grasp on the world and what matters, on what matters, and even how it matters. Specifically looking at the how it matters part. If you kind of think about any interpersonal relationship that you will have with somebody, it seems like there's kind of at any point of derivation where you can reach a dissonance between the two people.
Yeah.
In a sense where you and I might both very much value philosophy, but in the realm of philosophy, we disagree.
Yeah.
So I guess my first question to that is, to what extent does a person have to value the same things as you for you to feel affirmed?
Yeah.
And also, if you will only ever feel affirmed if somebody really agrees with you and values in the same way that you do, then it kind of seems like the only way that you will feel affirmed is if you reach somebody that's identical to you in a sense. If you're searching for identicality, it seems like the only thing you'll end up with is loneliness.
Yeah, I think searching for someone who's identical to you is wrong. Don't do that. That's not going to happen. It's not even possible. You can share very many things with someone. So some of my closest friends are people who are philosophers, but who also had similar childhood experiences involving like class status, involving like experiences with family, and so on and so on and so on, right? So like I share a lot of things with those people, but I don't expect identity from those people. So it's a continuum. I think that, but this goes back to the question of like how much to expect a little bit, right? Like how much can we reasonably expect in terms of affirmation? And I'm not making a claim about that because it's just a hard thing to say. I think we can reasonably expect to have co-valuers because all we need there is someone else to value something for its own sake. I do think that the connection can grow and the affirmation can become deeper the more that we share. But I think you ought not to, because it's not possible to achieve, you ought not to aim for like total, I mean, for it to be exactly the same, to have like your exact like evaluative identity, to have your evaluative identity be exact. And that's a risk of this kind of work, right? Is like, well, you can just like start laying out all the forms of like deep affirmation and be like, oh man, like, but that's cool, but that's cool, but that's cool, right? So there's a kind of risk of becoming acquainted with these like deeper forms of affirmation. And they're like, well, that would be really good though. It's like, yeah, okay, but co-valuers, that's possible. Like, and yeah, it'd be nice to have people who give the same reason for valuing the thing. That'd be nice, you know, and it would facilitate certain things. It's not always possible, and so we have to be realistic. I mean, this is again the like balance point. Is like eventually we just have to. We do have to adjust to the world. We need to, and I also think that. Okay, side point. Sorry, real quick. Kind of sorry, kind of not sorry because it seems very important to say. If we're looking for like someone else who is exactly like us, and that's how we're like moving through the world, and also if we're moving through the world like hoping that like someone's like, okay, where's my like loneliness alleviator? Like where are they? Like that's a wrong way to relate to people, right? Like we're not gonna be able to tend to the person in front of us if we're just like, hey, okay, so like, are you exactly like I am? I'm like this, me, right? It's usually much more organically that these things emerge, and there is a risk again of focusing so much on this that you cut off the possibility of like a personal relationship with people who co-value things or whatever because you're so self-obsessed. So I think that's a thing to point out here. There's something else I was going to say, but I forget it now. And your hands, yeah, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, I think wouldn't an individual's differences with somebody else over something that they're both interested in be something that could be really important for the development of their relationship?
Yeah, it can be really interesting. Yeah, good.
Like people might have certain gaps in their information because nobody knows everything. And so if two people are interested enough in something to develop enough of a knowledge base to connect on something like that, then they can also be like mutually inspiring or educational in that way too, because they're different from one another as well.
Yeah, awesome, good, totally, yes. And it's not just about like different levels of information, but like the best philosophical conversations I've had with people who share the same interests as me are ones where we disagreed. And we didn't like leave that conversation getting exactly on the same page and the world mattered to both of us in just the same way. That's why I said in response to an earlier question, it's really the valuing the thing for its own sake, right? Like we're both really getting something out of the philosophical conversation, even as we, even though there are differences that remain. And you're right that these differences can be really exciting parts of how we co-value. And they can also allow us to appreciate things. Like we can get closer together, or we can stay far apart, and still that can be a very meaningful form of relationship. I don't say this here, but it was something that I was originally going to say. Then you saw the talk; it was long enough. There wasn't room. But there is also the case that like this isn't a case of sympathetic emotional resonance, and it's not a straightforward case of co-valuing. So that's why I didn't make it in. But again, a couple of my closest friends are extremely different from me. And part of why they like me, why they appreciate me, is because I'm different than they are. Because like I have ways of being in the world that they don't. And that's part of why I appreciate them too. I find them fascinating and interesting, and it's fun to talk to them and like imagine what the world is like from their point of view, right? And there's something about these differences that makes possible the kind of relationship we have where like, oh, you're different than I am, but like you're just my taste, like you're just my style. Oh, likewise, you know? So that's another form of relationship where I think there is this like quite, it's like harmony instead of resonance. And then I was like, okay, we're gonna just talk about these things for now. I think those make possible like very cool relationships that allow for the person who's the object of like interest and grip and fascination, and that's a two-way street, right? To feel like really appreciated. Like, oh, cool, you like me because I'm like weird in this way? You like this kind of weird? Great, I like that kind of weird. Yeah, so that's another thing. Really nice, thanks. Yeah, great questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. So this is a question, a clarifying question about the structure of your account.
Sure.
So the sympathetic emotional response, that's the vibing one, right? So,
That's the vibing one,
and
yeah.
I think you said there's these two species of loneliness, right? The lack of co-valuing and the lack of vibing.
Yeah.
And so then, am I right that we could have each without the other? So we could have someone we co-value with but aren't vibing with, and someone we're vibing with but not co-valuing with?
So it's tricky because when we co-value, I think we will often have experiences of sympathetic emotional resonance that involve, again, like resonance between two people involving like a shared grip or interest or concern or whatever. Yeah, and I thought to say, or to try to say some more about that. I do think that it's possible to have co-valuers without sharing experiences with them. So like imagine like online friends. Sympathetic emotional resonance is an experiential thing. And so you won't have that, or you won't be able to feel it, right? Like the feeling of it's quite important for the belonging work that it's doing. It's embodied, exactly. And the kind of understanding that it involves, this like affective understanding, is different. So when I imagine cases like this, that's why I think like, yeah, okay, we can pull them apart. Although when you have co-valuers, you will very often, if you're engaging with them in person and you're like both in the right mood, you'll like vibe on stuff, right? It's like we're all, like, I mean, I would say we're all, but like many of us in this room are kind of like vibing on just these ideas right now, right? Because like we're into philosophy, or we're into like whatever, we showed up to this talk for a reason, here we are, and it's like, oh yeah, this is interesting. Like it's, you know, I figured this out, I didn't figure this out, what's this about, right? Like this is a kind of experience of sympathetic emotional resonance for a number of us, here we are, made possible by the fact that we're co-valuing a thing. Yeah, you know, and if we were in like an online forum, we would be co-valuing, and that would be very cool and would involve a deep sort of affirmation, but it wouldn't have the experiential part. And the experiential part matters.
So vibing is a subcase of co-valuing maybe, or it sounds like you could have co-valuing without vibing all the time, right?
Yeah.
But you can't have vibing without co-valuing.
I think that here there is like, I think we have to talk about whether it makes sense to talk about valuing as like synchronic versus diachronic. So I take it that like when we value something, we like value it over time. And I imagine that like, I don't know, we can have experiences of sympathetic emotional resonance in a moment. We're like, oh yeah, this song rocks. And then just like go back to our day and like not really value the whatever, right? So I think that's.
You could have the vibing without co-valuing.
That's right.
I see. Thanks.
Yeah.
We have time for one more short question, I think.
I don't know. Okay, actually, you can modify this or moderate this one.
Students.
Okay, go ahead.
I was just wondering if you could maybe expand on like the not being able to kind of like vibe over, like I guess the internet or something like that. Like, is it specifically when you are just talking on like an online forum, or because I feel like me and my friends will play like video games together, and I feel like in that kind of setting you can have kind of that shared like vibing when you're.
Yeah.
So, but is that more of an experiential thing, or do you mean to say like it's purely like a physical, like person to person?
I think there's an embodiment thing going on here. So what does, like when you're playing video games, what kind of, what does that look like for you?
Just like we're all in like a voice call. And
You're all in a voice call, right?
Yeah.
You're talking to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're like hearing each other, and like we get the kind of feedback from that sort of thing that like gives our body signals back. We can still feel like, of course we can. Like I love the internet, and I love like, so I've definitely like had very good, strong emotional responses that I've like assumed more or less are like being like reflected back to me. But it's not the same kind of, what's going on there is an inference instead of like a sharing in this embodied experience. And even in your case, you have this sort of co-experience of a kind that isn't there in the, oh, okay, they say that they're happy too. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, right. So like purely in just a like typing.
Right.
Voice connection still matters for that.
Yeah. I mean, think of it this way, like, I really like talking on the phone to my pals. I like sending audio messages too, like 7-minute long audio messages. And then every once in a while, I'll get one back and I'm like, oh my God, this is long, like 7 minutes? I'm like, okay, Katie, you know. Why do I like them so much? I feel the person, you know, like they feel like they're there with me. But it's still not perfect, right? Because we need to be together, so it's not going to count all the way. We need to be sharing in the same thing jointly, or not jointly experienced, but like the same, we need to be pointing at the same object in the world together, right, in the moment. But it gets me as close as I can to like that sort of thing. It's much better, right, than just texting, for me, right? And I think probably for, well, let me make just a bold claim, probably for a lot of people, to hear like the voice of a beloved friend, it depends on the nature of the friendship, of course, does a thing. It does a thing. I also like FaceTiming my friends and sisters. And I was just FaceTiming them yesterday. I gave them the version of the public talk. They were very cute about it. And seeing their faces is even better than hearing their voice, because then I'm getting a bunch of, right, like, yeah. So that's what I'd say. Good question.
Kind of a temporal, like, shared moment together that you don't get even when you're sending voice messages to each other. There's still that kind of like disconnect of not sharing like an actual.
Yeah, because.
At the same time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, like, what's key to these experiences of sympathetic emotional resonance is that you're responding to an object out there in the world together right now. That's what's key. And, right, like, there's a sense in which, like, we can respond over chat to some object in the world together at the same time, but it's missing this embodied thing. That's a necessary part of sympathetic emotional resonance. You guys, these are great questions. These are really good.
Please join me in thanking the speaker.
Thank you, guys.